This episode of the Police One podcast is sponsored by Officer Store. Learn more about getting the gear you need at prices you can afford by visiting officerstore.com. Courtesy of Officer Store, listeners receive 10% off now through December 31st using the promo code POLICE1. That's police and the number 1. Hey, welcome back. You are listening to Policing Matters on policeone.com. I'm your host, Jim Dudley, and you are listening to the special year-end review of 2023 and walking into 2024 with our heads up and looking forward. And I am joined today by my debate foil and friend and colleague, Dr. Joel Shults. All right. Well, we are counting down the final days of 2023, and we're going to talk about the top 10 issues in policing today. And hey, if you're a listener and you disagree, well, jump in, drop me an email at policingmatters@policeone.com, and my editor and me will take a look at it, get back to you, maybe do an update to the show. But I'm sure we're missing something. Joel, you are the guest, so take it away. What's your first issue of 2023?
Man, what an interesting year. Even in the surveys that P1 has done, there's just so much residual from 2020. The George Floyd thing is still rippling, and who knows when that will be overtaken by something. So I think one of the very interesting things is some of the backpedaling that has happened politically with the defund and police reform movement, and some of those things have stalled. Some of them have been repealed. Oregon, their drug legalization is coming into doubt. We all had doubts about it day one. Washington's rolling back their pursuit restrictions, and a lot of things like that are happening. And I think that's on the mind, and I might not zero in exactly on those 10 things that are on the list, but the political climate, I think, has hopefully changed. Part of that is always because of the fear of crime. We have disagreements about whether crime has really skyrocketed. We say that, and it certainly is true in certain urban areas. The UCR is so averaged out that it's hard to get a picture of what's going on in your own neighborhood. And fear of crime and actual crime are never the same. So our fear of crime is up, which is moving people back into a little bit more pro police attitude, I think, and that's the hope. And kind of part of that too is maybe a separate topic, or part of that is the concern about police prosecutions and whether those things are going to let up a little bit or not. Not that we need to let cops get away with stuff, but I always felt fortunate that I got through my career without being civilly sued. I don't know if you can say that or not, probably not, being from California, but now we have to say, are you going to get through your career without being criminally prosecuted?
Yeah, well, you got me on that one, because I've been sued a few times, twice by cops, one who later wrote a book, and I'm in 3 chapters, so I should get some residuals from that. But
Wow.
yeah, it's quite a story. I'll leave that for another time. But technology is my first big issue. And I think a lot of what you just said deals with technology. And hopefully we could catch up and make some improvements in our FBI, UCR, and NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. They rolled it out at the worst possible time. We knew it was coming. 2018, they were talking about it. 2019, they were going around the country telling they had tech support. There's some short videos on YouTube about NIBRS. And then 2020, at the big rollout, you nailed it. COVID hit and all bets were off. And so NIBRS reporting by individual agencies didn't seem to be a priority. And so now the effect is, if you say, so what? So we're not, putting data into this new database, which the improvements are that it's going to give so many more dimensions to the UCR, right? We're going to know more about offenders. We're going to know about weapons. We're going to know about victimology and, of course, place-based violence and crime. We're going to know more dimensions, many more, I think from 8 to 32 different categories. But the reporting it was somewhere at 60% in 2021. I think we've crept up. We're probably at that 75 or so percent now, but still with that gap in information, you've got the pundits and the anti-police, the reformers, all making up their own narratives about how bad or how good crime stats are. So that's part of the problem. And I wish that we got some more support from DOJ, from FBI to say, hey, we're going to come out, we're going to train civilian staff, and we're going to help support every agency by funding or giving partial funding for stat keepers, because I think it is really important. It drives what we do. It drives our initiatives, our operations, our enforcement plans. So that's huge.
And I,
But
and I don't know how much funding is available operationally. I just know that they've got that hammer. If you want to use our NCIC infrastructure, then you got to be a reporter, right? If you got an ROA, you got to be an ORI, you got to be a reporter. But you and I know as researchers, if you've got a 10-question survey, you're going to get better response than a 100-question survey because there's that fatigue. And I wonder about the accuracy of the results. And I'm a fan of UCR, but I am aware of the potential for abuse and manipulation and front end loading or unloading of crimes. I do appreciate the fact that they're including assaults on officers more accurately now. The old figure of 50,000 officers injured every year, that's ridiculous. Out of 800,000 cops, no, it's multiples of that. So yeah, that's an interesting development, and we certainly need some more support on that. I'm absolutely in agreement with you on that. And then we've got the use of force reporting with a national database as well. So it does get more complex. At the same time, when you need man hours on the street, and so the budgets are being stretched to accommodate that without any reciprocal funding. So I think that's a great point.
yeah, and then force options. So I sort of dovetailed force options into my technology issue. I was at ILETA, and I know you were too. I guess we just missed each other this
Everybody
year
missed me.
in St. Louis. But I got a chance to operate the Taser 10. I am not, any sort of great shot, but at 30 feet, I was able to hit the target so accurately with the Taser 10, and the Taser 10 gives multiple options, multiple charges in the weapon to fire over and over again. I think that's huge. When the older models, you had the one shot and that was that, and then you went hands-on or worse. Other technology related weapons, the BOLA wrap, I've seen that operated several times. Orlando at the FBI conference, at ILETA again, I've got a video of them using the BOLA wrap, and I know there's arguments against the wrap, but if everybody kept in mind that the Taser, the BOLA, and some of these other things would be used as an option if available, not to sacrifice yourself or put yourself in harm's way, but at least have an option, give it a whirl. If it doesn't work, then you go to your secondary option, and you always have live fire as a backup in cases where the suspect has a weapon. And also there's a technology called the glove, and it looks like a pair of work gloves, but they're electrically charged. They're ECW. And when you put hands on skin, you send an electrical charge similar to the Taser. And I've seen that be pretty effective. I felt the charge for an instant, and it was enough to get any kind of compliance out of me. So it's nice to see those filling in the gaps when, since you mentioned 2020, George Floyd, we lost the carotid almost nationally. The carotid restraint when clearly there was no direct result or effect on George Floyd from the carotid restraint,
No.
but the nation, there was such a moral panic that legislators and local jurisdictions said, okay, let's stay away from the neck, period. And I think we really lost a great opportunity, a great use of force option. And it's nice to see technology jumping ahead and filling in the gaps a little bit. And hopefully we're going to see many more in 2024 and beyond. I know Rick Smith at Axon has some really great ideas.
I hate losing those options. You know, we pretty much put a dark cloud over the side handle baton after the Rodney King arrest, and of course, LA was kind of ahead of the game on. I hate it when I hear about chokeholds, you know, and some of the legislation, if you look carefully, it doesn't really prohibit the neck restraints. It describes the choking as something we already don't do anyway. In fact, take great care to protect that. Do we have time for me to ask you about the Taser 10? Because I didn't know, I just read a little bit. What's this about a second trigger pull? Is that a second charge, or is it like one probe at a time?
It almost looks like a honeycomb where the cartridge holds multiple shots at the same time. And as I recall, you could shoot if it doesn't, you don't engage or you don't affect the charge between the two probes, you could fire again. And as it says Taser 10, I would imagine that you get 10 attempts at up to 10 attempts, or maybe you have multiple suspects. And you know, I'd have to go to their website and take a look at the specifics, but very effective. And the long range capability, you don't have to get up onto the, you know, you have the ability to give a contact shot, but by then you're hands on anyhow. But I love the idea that you can start it at that 30-foot level. I mean, you know, we talk about edged weapons. It might be something to consider at 25, 35 feet. And, you know, without effect, then you go to your backup. But at least it gives that option. And what really struck me was the accuracy.
I hope that it's not, and I haven't had my hands on one, and I haven't gone to any of the trade shows. I didn't see the one at ILETA or ICP or even SHOT Show this year. But do you remember the 3 cartridge taser they came out with? And you could have 3 people on the ground and shock this one and not that one and reshock this one, and it was just too complex for those high tension moments. So I'm curious what the field will reveal about this X10, but it's very exciting. And we also, I think we lost the shotgun taser, right? I don't think that's really gained wide use as less lethal. That was a really wicked piece of armament. The projectile went out on its own, wasn't wired, but it was just wired to itself. And so you had kind of a string along behind it, and you'd get the first cartridge here, and then the other part would kind of swing down. And I think the thinking was that anybody that gets hit with that is going to grab themselves and basically complete the circuit on their own. So anyway, yeah, this, and I remember my friend, our friend Dan Marcoux, talking about some departments say, okay, you only have 3 things on your belt. You know, okay, you got the bullet wrap, you got the taser, you got the firearm, you get all this kind of stuff. And I asked him if he thought, in his expertise, if you would lose some reaction time. And he said, if I remember to quote him accurately, he said, if you are proficient with everything on your belt, then you can have everything on your belt, you know, whether it's a stick or a taser or bullet wrap. So, you know, so many cops now are using the carrier, which is great. But you know, it looks like a convenience store with all the stuff, and so that's new to me. That's past my active era.
Yeah, I wrote a little bit about that, the load bearing vests, and you know, how many weapons do we make accessible to the subject?
Yes,
And if
great
we
point.
have scissors or we have a knife, or I even saw one on social media last week where someone had their firearm on their load bearing vest. And I just thought, oh my God, that can't be good.
Yeah, 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 yeah. And I have a problem with this seagull thing where you're always tucked into the vest like that. I'm like,
Right, right.
I don't know,
Yeah.
but
All right.
I'm old school.
Okay, so we'll talk about ALPRs and cameras and drones and AI later on. But what's your next big issue for 23?
Well, I know you had on your list when we had some discussion about what to talk about today is some technology regarding pursuits. And one of the things that in doing a year in review of officer deaths, I'm seeing cops, and it's been this way for a long time, getting killed by putting out the spikes to stop a pursuit. And I just don't know. I don't know what to do about that, but that's too many cops.
Yeah, I know every year we have at least one officer killed in related to the use of spikes. I'm not sure if spike strips is the brand name, but everybody knows or refers to them as a spike strip, where the officer ahead of the chase, in attempt to disable the offender's vehicle, positions themselves ahead, rolls out the spike strips uh, to nail the wheels of that car, and then retract them so that the pursuit officer doesn't get their tires blown out. And we've had officers lose their hands. You've had suspects avoiding the strip deployment and hitting the officer instead, or actually veering at the officer intentionally. I think in 2023, we had already in November 3 officer deaths related to spike strip deployment. So I know some jurisdictions are saying not only because of police officers, but because of pedestrians and other third-party vehicle operators are injured or killed as a result of the deployment, that they've stopped pursuits altogether. Some agencies like mine would order the supervisor to jump on every pursuit, ask a couple of questions about speed, location, offense, and things like that, and then either agree or terminate the pursuit. And so I think there's a real problem with a policy that just says we're not going to chase, because sooner, not later, the offender's going to know about the policy. And then, like we've seen with these organized retail thefts and auto break-ins, they know that they can do it quickly, they can get away, and there's no fear of pursuit. So I know there's a sideshow epidemic all over the country now. And San Diego at IACP, I talked to the Sergeant Ample, who talked about their strategy of using multiple jurisdictions and agencies to essentially surround and take over the sideshow, grab the offenders, grab their vehicles, tow the vehicles, lien sale them. And they have a great relationship with their prosecutors, and they prosecute, which is really important. They prosecute the drivers, the lookouts, and even some of the participants. And so we hit them in the pocketbook, we take away their beater, their vehicle, and we auction them off, and that should be that. So the idea of hands off, we don't want anybody to get hurt. We don't want to make the situation worse. I think that's a message we don't want to convey, because we've seen the opposite happen. We've seen more people hurt because these shows just get bigger and bigger, and they draw more people. And there are viral videos of people getting hit by these sideshow vehicles, just whipping around to the surrounding crowd of onlookers and supporters.
And I think there's good public support for that kind of enforcement. And obviously, as you say, the prosecutorial support is essential. And the Supreme Court has really been pretty kind to law enforcement in recognizing the deadly force potential or the deadly potential of offenders, and not cutting us off at the knees and saying, no, you can never shoot these guys, you can never chase these guys down. So that's been interesting. I'm still concerned about officer safety even in those situations. So many of our officer deaths, going back over ODMP this last year, are still dying in crashes, and it's not usually from pursuits, it's usually from response. And so, not sure what to do with that other than to tell guys to wear your seatbelt and slow down.
Yeah, I mean, those are two of the tenets of below 100 that say wear your seatbelt, win, right? What's important now? Like, how bad do I have to get this guy? How bad do I want this guy? Is it safe for people in the street? Are you going to come up to a school zone, at school hours? Yeah. At some point, it's hard, especially to be objective when you're in the pursuit, but that's why we have the supervisors, off scene making the call. But we also have some great technology. The Star Chase device is one that can be shot from the officer's vehicle onto, it essentially just shoots this magnet device that will then track the vehicle. And we've seen these vehicles used in some of these robberies or ram raiding or vehicle break-ins, and they're stolen or they have no plates. And so the idea of tracking them down by the plates, if you find it, it's stolen, you still don't know who the suspect is. But in this case, you have the actual vehicle. So you can terminate or back off the pursuit if you have air support or if you have drone support. You can definitely track it on a computer, on a mobile video terminal, if you have the capability, and then catch up to at least the vehicle after the fact. The grappler is this device. I don't know if you've seen it, where it shoots, attaches to a wheel, essentially puts the clamp down on the wheel. It's still attached to the officer's vehicle, and it essentially wraps up, disables that vehicle and brings it to a safe stop, as opposed to the pit maneuver, the precision immobilization technique, where, once you tap the rear end of that pursued vehicle, it's a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get after that.
Well, I started policing in the late 70s, which means I worked with guys from the 50s and 60s. How things have changed. Their pursuit policy was you have your partner in the passenger seat, roll down the window and fire at them. Yeah, thank God for technology.
Yeah, those days are gone.
They've got to be.
All right, what else you got?
Well, one of the things that showed up on the P1 survey was fear of prosecution. And cops they're afraid of ambushes, which is a continually increasing problem. Responding to mass shootings, which I know they get over-reported and over-defined, but gosh, it is a plague on the country. And then in the midst of this perception of crime rates going up and mass shootings happening more frequently, now you've got police out there who, in their top 5 or top 10 areas of concern, am I going to get prosecuted criminally and end up in jail for doing my job? And that's real. That's very real.
Yeah, and we've seen the one prosecution in Florida of the officer who failed to act, or was allegedly failed to act, stood by, radioed in, but didn't intervene in any way.
And and I'm a lot of opinions on that, but I'm glad he was acquitted, because we can't go down that road until we start hiring officers with parapsychological ESP about what's going on over here and what's going on behind my back and what this person's going to do. And the bright side of the prosecution of cops is that most of the time, if the right kind of testimony is allowed in court, and I've been shocked by how many courts refuse to let use of force experts testify. It's science, it's physics, it's biology. But so much of the time when you have an officer with a jury, the jury says, yeah, I don't know what else they could have done. We had the case here in Colorado in Aurora with Elijah McClain, and we've seen at least one acquittal in that case. And again, I'm not for cops getting away with stuff, but there's so many factors that are, thousands of factors that go into a decision that prosecutors are not understanding, and they're yielding too often to political pressure, like that guy down in Travis County, Austin, Texas. Just dozens of prosecutions against officers. In those, I've been in and around riot situations. Those are not easy decisions to make, and we have to restore qualified immunity in those states like my beloved Colorado, which very short-sightedly got rid of qualified immunity for officers. So that's a real concern. So if you were, and I always recommended this, even though I never personally did it, if you don't have an attorney on speed dial as a police officer these days, you're missing an opportunity to stay out of jail.
Yeah, I think 2023, we've turned it around a little bit. I know we've gotten rid of a couple of the prosecutors that were very light on crime, but they were big on, quote, reform. And in San Francisco, we had a district attorney who charged 5 different police officer cases. And I would have loved to have been the expert on any of those because they were all totally justified. There were all incidents regarding training, incidents of proximity, incidents of assaults on the police officer before the force was used. Of the 5 prosecutions, I think 2 were actually acquitted and the other 3 dropped when that DA was recalled and a new DA was put in place. So I think we're turning the corner on that. I hope we are. I just saw a case, I forget what jurisdiction it was in, but the district attorney essentially threw their hands up and said, well, the grand jury's going to look at it and they'll decide. And to me, that's a cop out, no pun intended. But it's, I've seen cases taken before the grand jury, and the old adage of you can indict a ham sandwich before a grand jury. I think that's so true because there's no defense allowed. It's all one-sided testimony. And I saw it happen in San Francisco. And after the smoke cleared, a judge decided that the officers involved were factually innocent, essentially wiping off the indictment from any records. But still, that taint is there. And
Absolutely.
The idea that the district attorney or the prosecutor or the state attorney is virtue signaling by going after officers to show, if, like you say, if deemed appropriate, yeah, nobody wants a bad cop pulling shenanigans. But in cases where an officer is using force that is constitutionally protected and protected by their agency, it's just, it is damning on the profession, personally on the officer. That officer's never going to come back. If they do, I doubt that they're going to be as productive as they were before the indictment. So it's time to, qualified immunity, that the public was sold a bill of goods on the portrayal of qualified immunity. Qualified immunity wasn't a shield against all actions. If you acted unconstitutionally or maliciously, you could still be prosecuted even with qualified immunity in place. And so I think in those areas where they did pull it back, it was a fraud. And we're going to talk about repealing some legislation too in a little bit.
I think, police leaders need to be out front and educating the public. This call for accountability, great, but it's redundant. We've had, you can get department discipline. You have the personal consequences of decisions that you make with your family and your finances and your career. You've got state prosecution, you've got state civil lawsuit, you got federal prosecution, you got federal civil lawsuits. So that's 6 ways that we've had police accountability since the 14th Amendment was applied to the states in the 1960s. So that the public just needs to understand something different than the narrative that they've been fed.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, I want to talk to you about training issues, but first I want to take a minute and thank our sponsor today, Officer Store, equipping protectors with passion. That's how we operate, and it's how we live. We understand that having the right gear can mean the difference between life and death. Our goal is to get you the gear you need, when you need it, at prices you can afford. Visit us at officerstore.com. And we're back, and I'm speaking with Joel Shults, talking about the year roundup 2023, moving into 2024. And I want to talk about recruiting and recruiting innovations. Recruiting has been a bane on the profession long before 2020, but 2020 seemed to just, was the perfect storm of the economy and George Floyd and reform movements and COVID. The impact was huge. The negative image of policing as being the uniformed visual point of government that was enforcing COVID laws, getting people off the beaches and out of movie theaters and off the streets at night. It was just so awful. And like I say, I think we were probably 15 years, at least a decade before 2020 in the dwindling numbers of people applying to be police officers. And part of the reason, I think, what I hear from my students at school every semester is the process takes too long. I got a job somewhere else. Or if they went to multiple agencies, they went with the first agency that hired them, not so much the one of preference, but the one of expediency. And so I want to talk a little bit about the innovations where essentially I think it comes down to this. If you are still carrying a paper file on every candidate, if your background investigators are still driving around or making calls while people are on vacation, or you're hiring retired cops to do backgrounds 2 days a week, and the other days those files sit languishing, you're behind the curve. And there are companies out there that do the backgrounds, and I'm sure, I'll hear from people taking pot shots at them and any inadequacy there. But essentially, everything's done online. You can do an audit, a signature online. You can fill in the background and push the button and send it online. So the idea of generating paper just doesn't make sense. And then the idea of a test, a written test in a month from now, you apply in a month, you could take the written test. And then 2 weeks after that, you can take the physical test. And a month later, you can come in for an oral board. And, it's ridiculous. So I think the agencies that are doing well, and I've seen it as few as 8 weeks from application to hiring. I think that's the fastest I've seen it. The applicant goes in, signs up, takes the written test that day. They take hair follicle samples for an initial drug test. They copy their driver's license, make sure they have a clean driving record, and then they do some preliminary background things. And you'll know if you have a felon day 2, right? And then clumping the other tests together. Maybe you take the oral board and the physical the next day. Maybe you take the polygraph and the psych within a day or the same day. And we're seeing innovations. I work with Rob Cate at Interview Now, and he's working on a candidate who could submit their profile with their preferences, salary, cost of living, live in the mountains, live in the beach, snow, beach, sun, whatever. And then the agencies reach out to those candidates. And I think with today's Gen Z, that's what they want. They want to be drawn in as opposed to being passively recruited. So the idea of giving them what they're used to, social media, the phone that's attached to their hand, all of those things, interactive capabilities of texting to a recruiter. When's the test again? Can I get a reminder? Yeah, it's a little bit of hand holding, but if that's what it takes, then we should be doing those things.
Well, again, I'm old school, and I agree with that. And when I was recruiting for for agencies, I would have 1 or 2 day testing to get all those things done, because you're right, particularly in remote areas. If I were in the Denver area, it'd be different. But in remote areas, people are driving 2 or 3 hours on multiple occasions, and yeah, that's passe. My concern is that waiting period was a test in and of itself of maturity and persistence and those kind of things. And I think about the classic case, I know it's back in the 70s, but of Miami, when they were very short on cops, and they went through this accelerated process, and they got a bunch of criminals and knuckleheads and paid for that. And I don't want to, I know there are other agencies that have had that trouble. I just remember Miami in particular is the poster child for expedient hiring. And again, different era technologically, you couldn't look at their Facebook profile and see if they were, doing whatever. But there are other cities, and I don't want to name any, that and get that in a contest with whether that was true or not. But so I have some concerns about that, but I do recognize that we don't have 50 applicants for every position like they did when I was competing for a job.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I am talking about expediency without sacrifice, without making concessions to your thresholds, right? So I'm not saying that we're taking a different applicant that we've taken before, just to speed up the process. Of course, we've seen in cities in the East, cities in the South, I'm sure cities all over, but when you do compromise your standards, I think that's when we make our biggest mistakes. And it might take, a year or 2 or 5 before these bad seeds turn into bad apples, turn
Right.
into a tree of fruition that we don't want on our streets, and then we see it on the media. So I think you're right there, that we don't compromise, we don't lower our standards, but my goal is to speed up the process. Joel, if you go to medical school, you are expected to be in school for 6 years. If you go to law school, 4 plus 2, and so there's that expectation. But for policing, to apply and then 6 months, 9 months later, the agency calls you and says, "Hey, guess what? We're taking you in. The academy starts in 2 weeks." You might be at 180 degrees from where you were if you remember that you applied 6 or 9 months prior. So I think it's just so unreasonable. I think there's so many ways that we can speed up the process. We can offer conditional employment at some segment where we've done the criminal background, we've done some psych testing, things like that. But that the process continues while the person's in the academy, maybe the first couple of weeks. And if we do find something in their background, or they're disqualified for an injury or something, then they know full well at that conditional offer of employment that they may be asked to leave, and there's not an issue. But the idea to just keep stringing people along for months and months and months just doesn't make sense to me.
No, and it's it's the economics of supply and demand. Like I said, you can't say, okay, well, we don't need the first 10 anyway. We'll just go to the other 40 that desperately want this job, because if you're late to the sale, the shelf is going to be empty, and that's what agencies are finding. I will be interested in longitudinally the effects, probably mixed effects, of these big bonuses and housing allowances and moving expenses and all this kind of stuff. To me, for somebody who's always worked in small agencies, the dollars that some officers are getting now, and I realize that a San Francisco dollar is different than a Southern Colorado dollar. But the financial incentives out there for people who are increasingly not required to have a college education or a pristine background, really a great opportunity. Although I have to say, for the first time in my career in the last 2 or 3 years, I'm not enthusiastic about encouraging young people to go into law enforcement. It's just a really, really difficult, challenging time.
Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. I want to unpack a couple of things. Number one, the San Francisco dollar compared to the Colorado dollar, I think we're talking pesos in San Francisco as opposed to Colorado dollars. But the gap in proactive policing, I think, from what you just said, I'm on the other side of the spectrum where I am teaching 150 students per semester over 4 classes. And my message to them is, it is a career. It is a noble career. I think you want to get into it. If you want to change, if you want to, give back to your community, it is a great opportunity. I have had so many great experiences and opportunities in my law enforcement career. Especially to them, I think right now, it's not so much things that they want, but experiences. And I think if we could bottle that and sell it, and yeah, there are challenges with public perception, social media, maybe peer pressure. I gotta feel that that's changing. And Joel, when you came in, and when I came in 1980, we heard the grumblings from the guys who preceded us, and the WW2 vets were probably retiring when you were getting on. The Vietnam vets were there and retiring when I got on. They were still grumbling about 1967 Miranda, about
Right.
how they were never going to ever catch another crook because they couldn't ask them anything. So I think it's a different set of problems today. I think it's evolving, and I hope that there's a bright side of this, that we're going to come out with educated people. I think people are going to see, I think the nation has seen what happens when we try these ridiculous reforms, that when we water down prosecution, we come up with repealing laws, and we've seen the unintended awful consequences. I got to think that there's another side. There's an upswing to that pendulum.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I wrote, I think I wrote an article for P1 3 or 4 years ago. Is the pendulum swinging in the other direction? Well, actually, it was before George Floyd, so it was a ironic article.
Nice jinx.
But
Good jinx, Joel.
but you're right. It'll swing back. But we also have, and again, I just sound like an old guy complaining about the world going to hell in a handbasket. But I've worked in the school system as a safety director, and my wife's a teacher, and you see the disintegration of the family and the disintegration of respect for American history and the respect for authority. And I don't mean to sound like a curmudgeon, but this is a different generation than the one that I grew up in. Now I have high hopes. There's America's been resilient all these years, and I pray that it will continue to be. But you think about even the military. There are people that are just not. We don't have the same pool of people. First of all, numbers, because of the birth rate, and then physical fitness, and then mentally fit, and having the attitude that, by God, this is the right thing to do, and I'm going to go serve. The young people that are willing to fill those shoes and wear that badge behind 40 pounds of gear and get recorded 24 hours a day, they've got to be super. And so I have high hopes for the ones that are willing to stand in the gap.
Yeah, for sure. So what do you got, or should I move on to my next idea?
Well, yeah. What the only other thing that I had that I wrote down in my notes was to talk about the public mass shootings and whether we've had some great successes in police response in the last year, but it's still happening. And I'm a Second Amendment guy, and the conflict between individual liberty and public safety is, man, I don't know how we're going to solve that.
Yeah, no, for the record, I am a Second Amendment guy too, but I think as far as firearms go, um, the idea that we just keep adding more and more gun laws, restrictive gun laws. I think when we look at a city like Chicago with 700 homicides a year, or Oakland with over 100, with such a small population every year, that we keep seeing the chronic offenders going
Yes.
through the system, the turnstile, and sometimes with guns. And I don't think the public is that aware of the fact that, we everybody's against guns, right? Politicians are against guns, prosecutors are against guns, everybody's against guns. But then we catch an offender with a firearm who's maybe even used the firearm, or they used a firearm while they were out on probation or awaiting trial for another offense. And these guys keep getting multiple bites at the criminal justice apple. And
Right.
I think that's got to stop. And politicians, we know that they yield to public pressure, public opinion, that it's unfair, especially against a minority segment of young men in the community. And I think that attitude has to change and I think, again, technology and innovation will, if we could somehow go to a system where people weren't judged by the color of their skin, their gender, their age, or what have you, but maybe a barcode that says barcode 138697B, used a firearm, pistol whipped this guy, stole all his money, and set fire to his house and left. That guy gets 30 years. Boom. Doesn't matter if that guy's a guy. But the idea that we've got to take the bias out, and we've got to take the bias narrative out and go with these prosecutions. When you look at the devil's in the details, we see that small minority number of offenders are the chronic repeat offenders that we can
An
count on.
amazingly small percentage. Again, that police leadership needs to educate the public about what's really going on, about prosecution, about firearms regulations, about demographics. All those things are very critical. That the factual, as I've said, facts lives matter, and to get a factual, unbiased narrative out there. When we talk about minority populations, I've said this for years. If you have a kid born without good prenatal care into an impoverished family, and their nutrition and their housing and their education and their family structure is inadequate, whatever their pigmentation, then the cops have a run-in with them at age 17. All of a sudden the cops are racist. No. And I'm not one of these, oh my gosh, there's total inbred racism, but it doesn't start with that traffic stop or with that a resisting arrest charge. It's a whole different issue that gets dumped in our lap, and then we take the blame for it, and it's just not fair.
100%, 100%. And I mean, the concentration is on the attention to law enforcement. Who's arrested, who's prosecuted, who's in jail or prison, when we should be looking at all the other factors of health and education and housing and employment and poverty. You're 100% right.
And I think the psychologicalization, I made that word up, of the criminal justice system is something that really needs some study. I mean, if we start excusing behavior because of, not to make light of mental illness at all, we all have people close to us that are struggling. But are we going to say, pat you on the head, get an evaluation, have you treated, and then you're back out on the street? Again, I don't know the answer to that, but the criminal justice forgiveness system is not sustainable.
No, 100% with you. And then we're not surprised. And Gordon Graham says predictable is preventable. And, there's that inside baseball that cops have when they open up the paper or they see on the news, this guy was arrested, and, his background, you've seen him before. The pattern is so similar that you could just change the name and the face, and it is the same story of that cycle through the system. And better than most people that the prosecution and the convictions of individuals the bar is so high for that
Right.
the defense has everything going, exculpatory evidence, and that one person that they've got to sway on the jury. They've got so much going for them that in order to get the conviction and then see that person out in 3, 6, 9 months when they should be doing 5, 10, 15 years, it's just tough to swallow.
And when I read something about a first-time offender, no. If you want to know who's going to be in prison with about an 80% accuracy, and I made that number up, but I think it's probably pretty true, ask any second grade public school teacher in this country. And they'll tell you, oh yeah, this kid. Now, my wife's been teaching long enough. She can read the headlines of people that have been victims, drug overdose deaths, imprisoned violent offenders. And so there's got to be something down line, like the old picture. Well, we keep rescuing people out of the rushing river, and nobody's going up to see why are all these people falling into the river.
Right.
There should be a fruit analogy for that. You're very good at that. I really appreciated your poetry today with the seeds and the fruit and the tree, and so I appreciate the way that you've expressed all these things.
Goodness. Well, the idea of the chronic offenders and the usual suspects, we have early warning systems for cops, right? We look at all the affecting issues that contribute to the outcomes. So yeah, why aren't we doing that you talked about it, prenatal care. If you have an alcoholic or drug using mother, that's passed on socialization skills, reading to kids, nurturing, nutrition, preschool vaccinations. Well, that's a subject we don't want to get into. But all of those things, they all count. They all matter when we have that 16, 17, 18-year-old first offender. You're 100% right there. Hey, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I was just gonna say my daughter works with kids as a therapist, and she said everybody loves and has sympathy with kids until they turn about 16 or 17, and then we just wait for them to go to prison. So, just to expand on your thoughts there.
Yeah. So real-time crime centers. I had a couple of great guests on the podcast this year. One from Elk Grove. Chula Vista's always had a robust live 911 system where they get drones out ahead of officers to gauge the situation, look for ambush points, look for the offender leaving or hiding. It also gives the opportunity for officers to talk in real time with the reportee or witnesses or victims. And so in smaller agencies, they may not have the personnel or the budget or the space to house a real-time crime center, but counties can certainly consolidate those small towns, rural areas. I'm sure Kathleen Diaz, the rural badge author, would appreciate throwing in the small town and rural officers dilemma of not having access to this kind of capability. So why aren't they working with a county umbrella to bring everybody together? And maybe you bring in a civilian volunteer or a civilian sworn or somebody to add to the team to have a representative at the real-time crime center. There's so many advantages, access to drones, to camera systems, to shot spotter, to license plate readers, to real-time crime maps, not just for crime events, and not just for plotting the same locations over and over of crime occurrences, but also for emergency management, for real-time weather situations, road closures, all those kinds of things that we could then push back out, not just to the cops, but to communities to say, stay off this road or stay out of this area or shelter in place or evacuate immediately. So many advantages to real-time crime centers.
Well, and even old school, I should make that a drinking game every time I say old school. But just tactical approaches that are trained. Are we still training officers to screech up to a scene and hop out? Or, because the two major elements of de-escalation or avoiding violent encounters is time and distance. And if you can slow some things down, get some intel. Back when, when we started having ubiquitous cell phones, I tell the guys, call the complainant, unless somebody's getting shot at or beaten up right this moment, call from a block away, ask what's going on, get some descriptions. Dispatch is not going to have all the information. They're going to give you the Reader's Digest version. And so now that technology has these advantages of the surveillance, all under the specter of totalitarianism, we don't want armed government agents to know too much about all things. But I love license plate readers. I think they're a huge boon. Drones, we probably haven't scratched the surface of the utility for drones, both interior and exterior surveillance and intel gathering. So yeah, those are exciting developments.
Yeah, and I had Blake Resnick on from Brink, and I mean, the drones that they're not the drones that we saw 5 years ago or even a couple of years ago. The Brink drones are made in Nevada. They are US made, and they've got the capability of hovering in place, of going interior, of video and audio, essentially a flying throw phone. So many advantages to those types of pieces of technology that are just scratching the surface, like you say, and they're going to be so useful. I could think of probably a half dozen incidents where officers were shot or killed when these things in place could have probably prevented the ambushes or the attacks. So, if again, I think about the DOJ, and we know they're quick to jump with consent decrees, but
Right.
I wish they would add the incentives and grant funding to supply some of these things. And I think there's a big issue that probably not going to talk about today, but with foreign made drones and the idea that they may be picking up critical infrastructure, our operations, our techniques, our strategies, our infrastructure, all of that. And I think there's a move afoot to bring the drone back to the US made, that we could shut down any sort of backdoor intelligence gathering on those parts.
So you don't know of any SWAT teams that use Chinese balloons to
Nope.
I'll just pick a few scabs here and there.
So speaking of which, what about artificial intelligence? Would you see that? I mean, in schools, I've seen some situations where overnight students are writing these PhD type papers with the assistance of Chat GPT. And are we ever going to see AI in those situations come to policing? Are we going to see? I know prosecutors don't like them, and public defenders love to see boilerplate police reports that say the same thing: insert address here, insert offender here, insert what evidence is found, fingerprints, blood, weapon, whatever. The boilerplate template reports are no bueno. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, we're going to have to do some follow-up technology by somebody to put some kind of watermark on the AI stuff. We had that concern with when I first started using body cams. I was just using off the shelf things, and then everybody said, okay, you need to make sure those can't be edited, and that they have secure storage, and that you don't superimpose somebody's face on somebody else's head. And those are real issues that are. It's just like fire. Fire's great, unless it's out of control. The internet is wonderful, but it has decayed. And so if we can know what's AI generated, to some extent, we all thought nobody's ever going to be able to do math in their head once everybody had the calculator, in their pocket, and that's become true, right? So it's a balancing act. I mean, I'm sure it's a great thing, but it's very scary, just like any new technology.
Yeah. And we know some states have banned the use of facial recognition until they're 100% right. I know that early on, turnouts of facial recognition software, was spotty at best. I remember one article that talked about 40 members of Congress were put through AI, and it found out that that 90% of them had felony warrants out or something like that, which I didn't think was wrong, but apparently it was wrong. Just kidding. But you get the idea.
Now I'm wondering if I'm talking to a robot or not. You got me paranoid.
But the idea of other forms of AI, like crime mapping and actual crime prediction based on, the history of an area or a location. Are we getting too far afield where we start putting too much concentration on an area that's unwarranted, or that we can be manipulated with the data?
Well, we had the same problems with the old-fashioned pin map. Shot spotters have been taken down because of why you always picking on this neighborhood. So it's just this predictive policing thing is it's math basically. You in statistics, if you have these factors at this frequency and this location. I remember years ago studying a map of Chicago where they overlaid the liquor licenses with the homicides, and great correlation there. So if it's facts, then it's facts.
So you're calling for a repeal of the 21st Amendment. You're going back to the 18th.
We haven't explored historically all the good things that happened during those periods of large abstinence. I know the Baptists get accused of starting organized crime because of prohibition, but there were a few things that were okay about that.
All right.
No, I'm not advocating it.
Okay. All right. So what else you got? I've got one more, but I want to give you the opportunity to jump in.
Oh, go ahead with yours. I'd rather knock yours around.
Okay, so maybe we'll wrap up with this, and I think we both have a lot to say about leadership being the key to everything. And when we talk about leadership, what comes to mind if people think the sheriff, the chief? Yeah, that's leadership, but leadership in the patrol car, leadership in a one-person patrol car, doing the right thing. I think going back a little bit to 2020, and recruiting and the recruits we're getting now, I really fear that anyone hired after 2020, the effect of March, April, May, June, July of 2020 really impacted our new cops. And so the idea of proactive policing seems by all accounts to be way down. And so are we starting a generation of cops that don't know about jumping out on three guys who we can articulate are gambling, selling drugs, drinking, doing drugs, casing a car, casing a vehicle or a storefront? Are we losing that? And what about the leadership of senior officers? And, we talked a little bit about it a few minutes ago about how aggressive do we want to be with qualified immunity dwindling? How do we want to be aggressive when we know we might be in an area where we have a prosecutor who's can't wait to prosecute a cop? So how do we fill that gap?
Wow. The old adage, no contact, no complaint, has never been more real in terms of decision making on the street. And I hadn't made the connection that you made, which I think is brilliant. No contact, no contagion for those that came on in 2020. So the leadership issue, it is very important that it's local, but you can't get quality leadership downline if you don't have it upline. I was reading an article by Jim Glennon the other day. He said he used to get lots of calls and did lots of training in ethics, and he said nobody calls, nobody cares anymore. I mean, that's perhaps an over exaggeration of his conclusion, but whatever happened to ethics? And I've learned in my police leadership career that if you don't go into a job willing to be fired, then you're going to compromise because of the political nature and lack of job protection in statutes in most places for the chief. It's definitely a trickle down economics when it comes to leadership.
Oh, I'm glad you qualified that with the chief being not assuming the position unless they're willing to be fired or
Right.
Yeah, no. And I think that's so important to our troops today. And I mean, across the board, I know we have some agencies where we did that Police One survey a few years back, 4,000 respondents, and only 7% said that they would advocate for others to join their agency. And wow, 7%, I was blown away by that.
Yeah.
And they certainly wouldn't recommend that their initial relatives, their sons, daughters, spouses, would join their agency. And I think that, again, is reflective on our leadership. And then we have, sheriff down at the border of New Mexico, I think it's Cochise County, Sheriff Daniels, who says he's got people lined up going into his department. And he's a great guy, and he is 100% behind his troops. He has stood up against some federal issues and opinions about how he should be patrolling down there on the border. And so I think when you have that kind of leadership, you have your officers, your men and women on your force that will do what you ask them to do, that do the right thing, that would recommend the job to anybody at their agency. And I think it's so important that leaders are willing to do that. And we talked about leadership for years. And in 2020, it'd be interesting to see how many chiefs and sheriffs step down. Probably not a lot of sheriffs because they're elected, but I did see a lot of chiefs leaving. And I'm sorry for those who had planned to leave in 2020, but it seemed like we had an extraordinary amount of chiefs leaving in 2020 when things got really tough.
And I would add to that, we've had tremendous success, I think, percentage wise, of non-white male chiefs in the country, females, African Americans, other backgrounds, and they were not immune to those political pressures. And I thought it was particularly tragic when we lose a black police chief, lose a female police chief, in thinning out the ranks that we have as a profession for 30 years really tried to promote, and they're getting metaphorically shot down, along with a bunch of other leaders. And thank God for elected sheriffs that we still have at least 4 years, barring a recall. Maybe New Mexico it's 2 years, where they can operate and just do the right thing and wait for the ballot box to vote on whether people appreciate their style or not.
Yeah.
And I talk about job security because, I'm 3 for 3 in the chief world as far as getting fired.
Well, that should be 3 badges of courage for you.
Absolutely. That's the way I narrate it anyway.
No, believe me, I've been on a couple of what some of my peers called career killer quests that you do it for the right reason and take the criticism. And it's funny because oftentimes they criticize the person and not the policy. So I figured anytime that was happening, then I was doing a good job. But
well, let me ask a personal question.
Yeah.
You were at the high echelon, but not chief, right?
Right.
Did you aspire to be chief, or did you say, I've got a job I think I can keep at this level?
I was a 40-year-old commander, and captain is our last civil service rank. So I was promoted by one chief to a commander at 40. And I was thinking that then, like, holy smokes, how do I get through this job for another 10 years? But then I quickly got over that because you could be paralyzed, right? The paralyzation by analyzation of everything. Can this get me fired? And so you can't think that way. So right. 2 years later, I got fired. No, 2 years later, I was demoted back to captain by an incoming chief who was directed by the mayor to clean house. So fine, I went back, and I'll tell you this though, as a captain, I kept my head up, kept working hard, kept supporting my people. And then another 4 years later, we got a new chief. He promoted me to commander. A couple of years later, another new chief came in and promoted me to deputy chief, right below the chief rank. And I really enjoyed that role because I still had hands-on in a lot of things. I got the opportunity to cultivate some of the captains under my command. And it was a good job. I did apply for chief when they were looking for a new chief in my last 2 years. Wasn't selected. It is a selection process by the police commission and then the mayor, and the chief is selected. And it's a political position. And some part of me is glad that I didn't get it because I'm not a political guy. And, as long as I've been doing the podcast, I've been accused by there's a rating on Apple that says this left-leaning liberal guy from San Francisco. And in San Francisco, I am like an ultra conservative. So
I bet
I can't play politics. I just, shoot from the hip like you. I totally believe in our Constitution. I believe in our laws. I believe there's a correlation between enforcement and crime. And I think we should all be doing as best as we can, regardless of how secure we feel in our position. So I wish, and I see some great chiefs out there, and I've had them on the show. Jason Potts in Las Vegas is just doing a phenomenal job. I've got Dave Norris down here in Menlo Park, and these guys are out front. They're using social media. Sheriff Daniels, as I mentioned, they support their troops. They push their troops forward for recognition. They're not taking the credit. They're pushing the guys. Pocatello, Idaho. Um, the chief there is just phenomenal in getting his local university students involved in his department. And we've seen examples like that across the country. And I think, in trying times, right, we see people stand above the rest. And I hope
Right.
that they could be inspirations to others.
Well, and just a little anecdote. I did a ride along with LAPD years ago, out of the Hollenbeck station, and I was treated like royalty because I was a small mountain town Colorado chief, and it was like a god coming out of the clouds. It just like that was everybody's aspiration. I'm going to retire, get out of LA, move to Colorado, and be a chief in a small town. And many of them have done that. But it's precarious. It's a real challenge. And like you say, if people are willing to stand up and do the right thing and take the hits, that's gold. That's life changing.
Yeah, and believe me, the troops know it. They see it, they recognize it. And they also recognize, it's a harsh word, but they recognize cowardice, right? They
Mm-hmm.
recognize someone who fronts officers or stays silent, probably for political reasons. I think one of the things that we really fall down, and it's not just chiefs or sheriffs, but I think it's some of the police organizations. When we see bad legislation, we should fight it tooth and nail. We should fight
Absolutely.
it like a murder rap. And instead, we allow it to happen. And one of the things I just did an article on 6 ways to reduce pedestrian and driver fatalities, civilians, and especially police officers, because it's one of the leading cop killers. But some of the legislation that we've seen, in refusing to allow officers to stop vehicles for minor infractions, to stop pretext stops, to repeal some laws, like in California in January, we have the freedom to walk, which is, I call it
Right.
the freedom to jaywalk law, that essentially says, unless the person is injured or caused an accident, you can't issue a citation. So I guess the measure is, if you make it from one side of the street to the other unscathed, then it was okay. It's hard to give a citation to somebody being loaded into the back of an ambulance, but that's essentially what this legislation did. And so in California, if I were to ask you, of the 50 states, which state leads almost annually in pedestrian injuries and fatalities? Which state? Take a guess.
You?
California, right. And the idea behind the law was that stopping people for jaywalking was used as a tool to approach Black and brown segments of the community.
Right.
If you look at the epidemiology, the people most likely to be injured or killed in vehicle accidents, pedestrians, which segment of the community? By large, in California, Black
The
and
ones
brown
that we,
community.
the ones that you try to protect by enforcing the law.
Yeah. So, I mean, how that ever got to the governor's signature in January, beyond me. But again, I think we need to get together. We need to inform the community. We need to bring people like Vision Zero together, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, anybody who's an advocate for pedestrian vehicle enforcement. Bring them up, ask them to stand with you and oppose these kinds of laws or repeals of laws. I think, I don't know how long we're going to wait, because we see high numbers, rising numbers of injuries and fatalities. It's at some point, I think they've got to look at repealing that.
Yeah, I don't know whatever happened to the concept of the enforcement index, which there's a relationship between holding people accountable and having bad things happen. And that, again, it's a math question. It's a statistic question. How that escapes policymakers is just astounding.
Yeah, and 15,000 to 17,000 annual deaths on the roadway would indicate that something's got to be done. And the fact that in those injuries and fatalities, that a third of the drivers or pedestrians, one of the two, has had exceeding levels of alcohol and or other impairments in their system. So it's there, it's important. I wish legislators would recognize it. I hope cops see that correlation and the need to keep up enforcement on traffic laws, and especially driving under the influence of alcohol or drugs.
I was in Honduras on a military mission in the 1980s, and I came back more convinced than ever about the importance of traffic laws. And I don't know what it is down there, and we were far from any urban area, but we weren't allowed to drive at night. We were off the roads. You had to, if you were going up the mountain in the sunset, you bivouacked because it just wasn't safe, and you'd see these vehicles careering down the mountain roads with one headlight, and you know, so to say, oh, it's just a minor traffic violation, you know, again, it just adds up to statistics and keeping people safe. And you know, we can talk about pretext stops as a crime intervention with traffic stops, but traffic enforcement for the sake of traffic enforcement has its own merit without coming across drugs and dead bodies and illegal weapons.
For sure. Well, I think we're going to wrap up. I know there's so many other issues we could talk about that are going to carry into 2024. Certainly, we're seeing more and better mental health and wellness support for law officers and their families, family support and resources. We could talk about cold cases, quick DNA, cold case assistance, virtual reality training that we didn't really touch on, and so many more in the way of technology assistance and training. We didn't really get much into training, but technology can help with training, and training should be on the 2024 priority of every agency. And if you're at an agency where you're not hearing about training, speak up, you know, slip that note under the chief's door and say, hey, you know, WTT, what the heck about training, or something.
Well, if you want to get my blood pressure up, we can talk about post boards and their requirements. I'm convinced that they are backdoor funded by Microsoft PowerPoint software. They were a great thing that came about in the 70s and 80s of necessity, but they are stuck in the 70s and 80s in what they require in terms of measuring things by hours rather than competencies, the type of media that's allowed, the type of teaching instructor ratios. A lot of good obviously came out of that. I'm a pre-post guy, so I could get grandfathered in. And when I did go to the academy, it was 120 hours. So we've come a long way, but there's a lot of impediments in our state's capitals with post boards who are stuck in old school ways.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, you know, if we're going to stick to the hour measurement, and I think the hour measurement is good. It was a tool that was used, excuse me, against us in the 2020 argument about police training, and how aestheticians or beauticians were required to have more hour training to curl hair and do nails than police officers. So that was used against us. I think we could definitely fill in those hours with video training, virtual reality training. And of course, it doesn't take place of real in-person training, but I think the repetition to get you thinking about what you would do in some of these situations, I think that's really valuable. Like if you get to someone, a suicidal person, on a ledge or on a rooftop or over a bridge, what do you say beyond 5 minutes or 10 minutes? And I think those kinds of situations, the repetition, give you more ideas of what you could do or give you some cues of what to look for as far as, and I think more's coming on pre-incident nonverbal cues, facial, body movements, all of those things with the hands, of course. But I think virtual reality can really, really help as far as if we're going to give them hours of training, let them do it.
If we don't stick 80s and 90s learning philosophies into 2023 technology, right? So I was on the curriculum committee for the post board here in Colorado. So there's curriculum, shooting, fighting, driving. And I said, hey, could we get together with the shooting, driving, fighting people? Because they never meet. And so, you know, do you wait till the officer's out on the street to determine on a car stop, use of force, verbal communication, de-escalation, traffic law, criminal law, constitutional law? They're all siloed. And maybe that's changed since I resigned from that committee twice in frustration. So yeah, training's got to be changed, and we get this politicized curriculum where you have to cram these touchy-feely things in when the real critical stuff, you know, low incident, high liability kinds of things sometimes has to suffer.
Yeah.
And we try to keep, in many communities, at least in Colorado, a lot of our pre-service training is done self-sponsored in college environments, which means that we need to get everything crammed into 15 weeks to be concurrent with the semester in the academic world. And that means, you know, if we get X number of hours and we've got to push something in here, we've got to push something out there. So you got me started.
Oh, we'll save that for another show.
I think we should, yeah.
Keep your notes. Joel Shults, always a pleasure. I look forward to debating with you in 2024 and having some more interviews like this to talk about things that are popping up. So many things that we could have talked about today that I hope to discuss in the future with you.
Well, thank you for your service. You know, the years beyond the badge, you're influencing thousands of people through this effort and your teaching. So thank you for your continued service.
Thanks, Joel. Appreciate that. Hey, to our listeners, I hope you enjoyed the show. And if there was anything you didn't like, you can attribute it to Joel.
Probably accurately, yes.
Just kidding. Drop me an email at policingmatters@policeone.com. Joel will definitely get a look at it, as will I, and our just such a great editor that we have, Nancy Perry. I want to acknowledge Nancy's service in our written achievements. They aren't achievements by the time I get them to her.
Hey, we're both award winners, right?
We are award winners, and actually Nancy's an award winner as well as being a superb editor. So if you get a chance, check out the other work that we've done on Police One in the articles and in our debate called State Your Case, where we take a subject and Joel and I get one side of the issue or the other and try to come up with some articulable points to support or shoot it down. Check us out. All right. Hey, have a great year. Stay safe through the holidays, and hope you check in with us in 2024. We've got some great things coming your way. Stay safe. Take good care. See you soon.